So I'd like now to pass over to Brent Ritchie from Queensland. And Brent is a very experienced tourism researcher who has very recently been focusing some of his research efforts on crises and how tourist industries respond to and within crises, which is very prescient, of course. So Brent, over to you. Thank you again for your time.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the invitation. It is, if you can see my background, it's not sunny, unfortunately, in Queensland right now. It's just after 8:20 p.m. But as Brian said, I'm still up and raring to go because this is a real crucial, important topic area. So my background, as Brian said, I've got a long-standing interest in crisis and disaster management for tourism. I did spend some time in the UK, and around 2001, I was researching the foot and mouth outbreak, and that sort of interest that piqued my interest in crises and disasters. And from then, I've done a lot of work on September 11, SARS, and GFCs, and so on. If you are interested in some of this area and some of the research findings, there's a couple of books out. The one on the left-hand side, I hope you can see, that's a Channel View Publications book. It's actually free to download. So if you type in Channel View Publications and look at the title there, you'll be able to download the book for free. If you're more of an academic, there's a free article here in Annals of Tourism Research, which does a bit of a summary of some of the key studies over the last 40 years in the field. So a couple of resources there for you if you're interested in the topic area. In terms of the topic, what I want to do is just make some initial observations. And then similar to Denise, I'll talk a little bit about the response phase. And I'll talk a little bit then about the longer term recovery. And it's hard to separate these because sometimes the lines are a bit blurry. And then I'll talk a little bit about the transformational learning. Are we actually going to learn anything from this? Is there actually going to be any substantial changes in the industry? So in terms of initial observations, as Brian's mentioned, post-COVID is going to be some time away, I think. I can see some glimmers of hope, particularly in Australia and New Zealand and other countries, which have sort of managed to contain the outbreak relatively well. But I think we are a little bit worried about additional waves of outbreak, as Brian mentioned. We are heading into our flu season, winter time, very soon, and we're very concerned about perhaps taking 2 steps forward and then taking another step back. So we'll have to see how that goes over the coming months. But we are starting to relax some of the travel restrictions here in Australia and in Queensland as well. As Brian also mentioned, recovery times are going to be staggered. So we're not really going to be able to say that world tourism's open until we can actually defeat the pandemic. And that's going to be quite some time away. I think it's really going to be when we get that the vaccinations, and that might be middle of next year or end of this year at the very earliest. But I suspect it's more likely to be middle of next year. On a positive note, 80% of tourism is domestic, give or take, and that's quite good. So that means there's a lot of opportunities for domestic tourism moving forward. And also with travel restrictions outbound, we're seeing a lot of people substituting perhaps their holidays in the next few months for domestic trips. They would normally take international trips. They can't do that now because of travel bans and travel restrictions overseas. So they're looking at holidaying at home. And I think there's some great opportunities for regional tourism. In terms of the impacts are not unequal. I think there are some industries that are more affected than others. And I think we've got to realise that a lot of operators are actually small and medium enterprises. We might hear about the bigger end of town, the large tour operators or hotel chains. But the reality is a lot of the operators are actually small and medium enterprises or owner operators. So if we think about the response phase and we think about the available resources that they have, the government's going to need to think about how they target these small and medium enterprises and make sure any support packages are easy for them to access and are not too complicated to access. And I think that's an important point I'll come back to a little bit later. But these small and medium enterprises don't have a lot of money and cash reserves. In terms of the impact, I mentioned airlines and tour operators, particularly the inbound and outbound tour operators are more affected than perhaps retail and hospitality, where there is the ability to pivot a little bit to local markets. And certainly we're seeing that in Australia. The hospitality industry is not as badly affected as travel agents. We've also got issues around casualisation, which is a long-standing issue in tourism, and this is having an impact in terms of some of the support packages that the Australian government's introduced. Some of the casual staff are not actually eligible for those job keeper payments that we have in Australia. So that's a problem. If people are actually employed on a casual basis for less than 12 months, they can actually access the funding that the government has to support businesses and staff. And I think too, this issue around the impact on tourism is probably going to have a longer term impact. I think with students possibly studying tourism and hospitality, when they see the impact that this is having, similar to other crises and disasters we've had, we've seen a bit of a downturn in enrolments in vocational and higher education courses. So I think this is a particular issue we need to look out for. And obviously too, in terms of the impact, it's particularly developing countries who might have a higher percentage of GDP allocated to tourism. I think this is going to be a potential problem, greater problem for them. They're going to be a lot more worse off than developed countries, perhaps with a more diverse economic base. So those are just a few initial observations. If I turn a little bit to the response phase, certainly we know from previous research that targeted relief packages work best for industries most impacted by these crises and disasters. At this stage though, because of the impact on a lot of industries, the Australian government has basically said if you're impacted in terms of revenue decline, regardless of what industry you're in, you can be eligible for what's called job keeper payments. And this is about $1,500 a fortnight that's paid to employers who then pass it on to employees. So even if you're a travel agent and you've been stood down from your job, or you're an airline, you've been stood down, you still get that income coming through, $1,500 a fortnight. So it's based on your actual decline in revenue over a 12-month period. However, some of the previous examples we've seen in terms of government packages, support packages for tourism, have been difficult for industry to actually access because they're small and medium enterprises. They often don't have the time and ability to navigate the complexities of applying for these fundings. We're also seeing perhaps not much in the way of marketing at the moment. There's really no reason to be marketing except for trying to put your destination in people's minds, to have a top of mind awareness. And we're seeing a little bit of that in terms of social media. As an example, here with Netherlands around Dream Now and Visit Us Later, and also seeing that with UNWTO #TravelTomorrow. So in terms of campaigns, there's no point in really running campaigns until the pandemic is defeated. So really at this stage, it's about top of mind marketing, using social media and public relations activities. It's perhaps looking at tracking consumer sentiment and trying to get an understanding of whether there are going to be particular market segments that are more likely to come back quicker. And then starting to perhaps look at the visiting friends and relatives market. So in some of our previous research regarding disasters and crises, we've actually found that visiting friends and relatives market is actually quite a robust market. They're more familiar with the destinations, particularly regional destinations. They're more willing to travel, and they have connections in these domestic locations. So they're often talking to the people about what's actually going on. I think that's obviously a key market segment moving forward. So that market intelligence, that tracking of consumer sentiment is pretty crucial, and goes on from the response phase right through to the recovery marketing. Here in Australia, we're seeing some local travel. We've now allowed to go from 50 kilometres travelling, day trips, to now 150 kilometres in Queensland. We're not yet allowed to stay overnight. I understand that's coming, and around mid-June, we'll be allowed to actually have an overnight stay of up to 150 kilometres. But we're seeing some of the states and territories lifting restrictions for cross-border travel, but Queensland is resisting a little bit and not planning on opening interstate travel until September. So there's a little bit of conflict going on between the states and territories in Australia. So Queensland's being quite cautious, not opening for cross-border travel until September. And as Denise mentioned too, at this stage, people are quite concerned about health protocols and so on. And we're seeing some of the industry associations and the peak lobby groups like WTTC coming out with procedures and plans and templates to help businesses think about those health protocols and to get plans in place so that when restrictions are lifted, they're able to have plans in place and actually take guests. So that's the response phase. If we move into a little bit the long-term recovery phase, as Brian said earlier, we do know tourism is pretty resilient. It does bounce back pretty quickly. But I think this particular event is unprecedented. And I think the impact globally is going to mean that slow recovery. Just on the right-hand side, you might not be able to see this too clearly, but there's been some modelling done for PATA, Pacific Asia Travel Association. And this is just showing the US and visitor arrivals to Asia Pacific as a whole. And the blue line is really the projections from 2020 onwards. And then what we've got is actually scenarios around recovery. So that was what they expected before COVID. And then you see some V-shaped recovery. But the pessimistic scenario says we're not going to get back till Q2 2022. So the US market traveling to Asia Pacific is not going to get back to where it should be until Q2 2022. And that's a 24% reduction in visitor arrival numbers to Asia Pacific. The most likely scenario is around Q3 2021, and that's a drop of around 17%. The optimistic scenario is Q1 2021 return and about 10% reduction. So we really are in for a bit of a slow recovery, I suspect. In terms of consumer motives, it's really important to understand that, and preferences, and Denise has mentioned this too, around health and hygiene. That's going to be pretty crucial. But also some of our work domestically, some of my colleagues are finding that even Australians, only around 50% want to travel domestically once restrictions are open. So there's a little bit of hesitation around traveling even domestically that we're seeing in some of the data that we're collecting. We've also collected some data in China, and we're also seeing some of these similar trends. People are quite anxious, a little bit frightened about travel, and it seems to be more around domestic travel, traveling by car, traveling independently, and concerned around taking public transport or traveling in groups. So I think this could persist for a little bit of time until we get over the pandemic. I can see some possibilities around cross-border or cross-country corridors. We may have relationships with countries with low cases. There's a bit of a story going around New Zealand and Australia having a trans-Tasman bubble because we both have quite low numbers of cases. So there's potential for transport between New Zealand and Australia. And we're thinking that that might actually happen around October this year. So for countries where there are low cases, we might be able to have visas and open up restrictions for travel. I think too, we're going to see more cooperative marketing because the dollars for marketing are going to be smaller. I don't think states and territories are able to actually perhaps compete with each other. They're going to have to cooperate together. And I can see more public and private partnerships in terms of marketing and the longer term recovery, focusing on higher yield markets. I won't say anything about events as a catalyst. I think Jane might touch on this, but often events are the catalyst for recovery after a crisis or a disaster. But I think with the nature of COVID, it's a bit challenging to do that. And I have got some concerns about tourism and hospitality careers and career paths, considering the decline in tourism and its impact on tourism. We're going to see fewer students, I think, enrolling in university study. And just finally, Denise mentioned business networks and the role of associations. What we're seeing is a lot of members quitting associations because it costs money. Right when they actually need the networks, right when they need the support, they're withdrawing their support because they can't financially afford it. So I'm a little bit worried about what that might, the impact that might have on business networks and support mechanisms through industry associations. Just finishing up, in terms of transformation and learning, there's a lot of talk and a little bit of rhetoric around building back better. And I think this particular comment here from the UNWTO about providing stimulus packages that can also transform the industry is very laudable. It's very aspirational, but I don't think that's really translating. When we see some of the government packages, it's all about getting the businesses up and running. It's not about helping them to transform or change their practices. So we're seeing some bailouts of airlines, we're seeing some support of airlines, but we're not necessarily seeing that tied to carbon efficiency or reduction in emissions and so on. So I think that opportunity is perhaps missed a little bit because we're so much focused on getting businesses back to normal. There are, though, as Denise has said, there are innovative things going on in the industry. We need to keep those things going. We have a tendency to perhaps at this stage, at the end, when we're coming out the other side of a pandemic, to think about the market or supply chain dependencies, think about our vulnerabilities and how to reduce those moving forward. Perhaps there's some good practices we've made. We've maybe changed products or pivoted to new markets where you need to keep that going. And also planning for these kind of black swan events. Often we don't have that actually happening. We tend to plan for a high likelihood but low impact events. So I think there can be some positives that we can take from this, but often it's very difficult when you're trying to save jobs and save livelihoods, that these things often are put on the back burner. So thanks for the opportunity for sharing some of my insights and ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Brent. So